The discussion today is going to be on this specific topic, as mentioned, interactive planning and dynamic supply chains. Um, a lot of big words there, but really, what we are here about aspects of a planner and what does interactiveness really mean. If we cover those three topics, I think we would have achieved quite a bit. And it's not very far-fetched to say that if there is any group which, if removed from a supply chain, would pretty much stop all activities in the supply chain, it is the planning community. It's becoming increasingly so in most large supply chains. You can remove procurement and somehow things could still happen. You can remove manufacturing, you could still subcontract it and so on. I mean, I've worked in different parts of supply chain, and increasingly what's happening is that the planning team is becoming the central control point for every supply chain. So planning in itself is becoming more and more important, and how we do planning and how effectively we can plan various activities in a supply chain is going to be more and more important. Complexity is only increasing. Dynamism, as it is mentioned here, is just becoming more and more. So with all this, given the importance of planning, how do we enable what we are calling interactiveness in planning? What does it actually mean? Why is it important? And what are some of the tools that could be used to enable that is what we're here to talk about. My name is Sesh, like you said, and I'm the co-founder of Spashta Technologies. I have background in the area of supply chain planning. That's pretty much what I've done in my career. I used to work for a company called I2 Technologies, which is part of JDA now for many years, for close to 11 years. And then I moved to Dell, worked in Dell for 7 years in their supply chain team, mainly in planning on both IT as well as on the business side of things. And then 2 years back, we started Spashta Technologies to build software products for specifically for planning, scheduling, and optimization. I'm going to talk more about planning and less about software. During the course of the presentation, I will still show screenshots of mock-ups or screenshots from our tool itself. That is only to enforce a point. This is not intended to be a detailed software feature discussion. It is more to discuss what are the effective ways of planning and why is interactive planning important, and within interactive planning, what are the things that could be done in order to enable it. So that's really the goal of the discussion. I'll quickly jump to some of the timelines. So the first topic that I quickly wanted to cover is planners. Who are these planners? What is it that they do, and why should we even talk about them? And I know a lot of people in the audience are planners themselves, and it'll be pretty presumptuous for me to tell you what you are, but I think it'll be good to kind of get aligned on what is the role of planners. And the second reason I want to cover that is, like I said, planners are very important to the functioning of the supply chain, increasingly so. If you look at supply chains, let's say 100, 200 years back, it was not so integrated. So each unit was kind of left to taking its own decisions. But in global supply chains, in large supply chains, the decision making is getting centralized. And I was a planner myself, and I was basically sitting in Bangalore and taking decisions which would affect material stock in Sydney, in Tokyo, wherever, at multiple places. And so that is basically what is happening in a supply chain. So the role of a planner is very, very important. What are the key aspects of planning over and above the very obvious things? I wanted to cover a few aspects of planning in general. And we would take 30 minutes there, and then interactive planning. What does it even mean? Where is it applied? And some of the tools. I would provide some tips on tools. If you're going to use spreadsheets, what are the things that you could do? You're going to use or build your own tool, or buy a tool and customize it. What are the things that you could watch out for? So I'm going to cover some of those things as well. It is, again, not a feature function discussion. It's more from the point of view of a process. That's what we will restrict the discussions to. Time permitting, we could discuss various other things. Typically, in more face-to-face settings, I would say, feel free to interrupt and just ask questions. Probably we can still do that even now. I mean, we are not. I don't think we have too many of us that we cannot do that. So I know all of you are on mute, but if you have a burning question, just interrupt and ask, because you might forget it later on. And also, the forum is also to get knowledge from you as field professionals, and you might offer some insights which could add color to the monologue. Otherwise, it's just going to be me talking. I think it will just benefit all of us if you have you think you have a pertinent question. Just jump in and ask. So that is the overall logistics. These are the 3 discussion points. Really, I'm going to move hopefully at a steady pace, and I'm not at some point in time. I'll definitely pause and ask questions before the start of each of these sections. But again, don't wait for me to do that. Ask your question whenever you think you have it. So with that, let's get to the first topic: supply chain planners. So planners are the central nervous system of supply chain, and if that team stops working, other execution functions, they won't function effectively. Sometimes they may not even function. A lot of things go wrong, and it's just based on my experience in how disruptions in the planning team. And there's not disruption. There's not because of the strike. There's not because of machine going down or anything like that. The planning team, for whatever reason, is not able to produce the output and give it to the people who are going to execute, and that causes disruption. And so it's like, in any organism, it's central nervous system. If it doesn't work well, how does it affect the organism? Quite badly. Doesn't matter if it has limbs and organs, but the controlling power is lost. So it's increasingly becoming a very important function in a supply chain, and the actual functions of the supply chain. Just give me a second. Are you able to see the entire slide? Okay. Let me minimize this. Yeah. So the individual supply chain functions basically get executed by decisions that are taken, and these decisions are taken by planners. That's typically how it works in a supply chain. The planners decide on the various aspects of each activity in the supply chain, procurement, manufacturing, distribution, shipping, delivery, and then sales. So each of these activities are decisions on these are taken upon by the planners, and it is executed. There is, like I said, increasingly very little room for doing the task to do whatever they please or what they think is right. So increasingly, the decisions are getting more and more centralized, or the decisions are being made in a way from what needs to be done, what is told. So load the next job on this machine. This is a job. that needs to be done. It's already there upstream of the machine. The worker will load it or go to this next destination for your next pickup. That is where the truck driver will go. They are not going to take these decisions on the fly, increasingly so because of various reasons. With more complexity, companies want to have global visibility of what's going on. So any decisions that they want to take has to take cognizance of all the things that are happening in the company. We'll just give me 1 second. So more so, the systems are being set in place where we have software now which helps the planning team to actually take decisions or help recommend decisions. And the software systems are becoming more complex. They can deal with a lot of the complexity instead of relying on the people, the team which is executing to do the job. So that is one point that I did want to make in this slide, the importance of planners and the key things that the planners need to have kind of embedded in their skill set, I would say, are these three things. I haven't put verbiage to this, but the first thing is to understand the function. What is the company all about? What is the product? What is the nature of the supply chain? Where are the constraints? What is stopping them from doing more? And how is that industry different from other industries? These are the functions that the planner absolutely needs to understand. That is the functional part of it. Second part of it is technical part of it. Increasingly, again, because information technology is going to be a very core part of every planning activity, planners need to have those skills on technology. How is technology enabling planning? The third part of it is cadence, and this is also a pretty important one. I have a separate slide in this second section on this. Cadence is highly undervalued. I've seen cadence help quite a bit in planning. Cadence essentially refers to the rhythm, the cycle of planning that every decision making goes through, and it is a very important aspect of planning because it gives the planners the foundation or the support to do a good job. Without cadence, it's going to be extremely volatile and extremely unsupported. There is no boundary or there is no guidance that the planners would get without that. And I'll talk about it in more detail, but function and technology part of it, I think most planners do understand. Cadence is something that I think has to come in more into our psyche, especially in India. When I see a planning community in India, I think cadence is something that needs to come in much more strongly. We basically are very good at firefighting, but setting a cadence and living by it is something that we haven't done an effective job enough. Okay, so that is all I want to spend as far as planners are concerned. I'll pause for a few seconds in case you have any questions. I just wanted to set the stage for what are planners and why are they important, just in case there's someone in the audience who's not a planner, or even if you're a planner, just get aligned on what is my understanding of planners. I'll just pause for a few seconds if you have any questions. Okay, cool. So now I'll talk about these aspects of planning. This is the next section. And in this section, I'll talk about these aspects of planning. And these are pretty important in every plan. The plan, the part of planning or the type of planning that I will probably keep referring back to is a supply plan, but doesn't mean that it is not applicable for other types of plan. So let me go back to the slide on planners. In each step, like I said, there are planning decisions taken, and different types of planning. A procurement plan has its own nature, and there's a emphasis on certain type of things, and a manufacturing plan has its own, again, constraints on planning and scheduling, and a distribution plan, a transportation plan, and demand plan. Demand plan is its own entity in itself. There are various aspects of demand plan that are quite different from the supply side of things. But like I said, the example that I will keep referring to is the supply plan part of it. Doesn't mean that all the things that are said here does not apply to other planning activities. They absolutely do. Just as an example, I'll probably refer to supply plan more than others. So the first thing is calculations. Plan involves generating of numbers, and it involves calculations. What are those, and why is that the case? Very quickly, I'll touch upon it. The second thing is cadence. We talked about cadence, and I do want to talk about cadence, because when we talk about interactive planning later on, that's the first question that will come. How does cadence and a non-cadence work together? And why should we have one or the other or both? What is the right answer there? I think that's pretty important. Input management, very, very important. And this is one part of, I would say it's actually as much part of an interactive plan than the output is. And I'll just share a couple of experiences based on what I myself did in Dell. This next topic is output. Just to be able to look at the output, as simple as that. So some of these things are very simple, very basic, but if you make it more effective, then it makes the life of the planner much more productive. At the end of it, given that let's say, we have a brain which is taking decisions for our body, and if you don't sleep, or if you just hassle your brain, then you're not going to take good decisions. In the same way, in a supply chain, the planning team, they would need the tools, they would need to be in great health for them to take good decisions. And so some of these things are basically tools to help the team to be in as fit as possible. So output, how do you look at output? Plan analysis and dynamics, I briefly mentioned here, but we will cover it in a little bit more detail in the next section, which is interactive planning. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover in this section of planning before we get into interactive planning. So calculations. So basically, in any planning activity, in any activity where there is a recommended decision that's coming out for one of those parts of the supply chain, you have a set of computations that are performed. And usually, unless it is a very small company, or it's a very small part of a large company, these computations are performed by software. That's something that, let me move this a little bit. Yeah, these computations are performed by software, and the software is what it's trying to do. It has a goal. It's trying to create a plan. If I'm trying to create a plan for the best loads that need to go into the truck, there's some goal that I'm driving towards, but that goal is also restricted by various things. It's restricted by what my business wants to do. It's restricted by the fundamental constraints in the supply chain. It's restricted by some of the rules that my team follows, so that I can drive the software in the right direction. And so with all this, it takes the inputs and it core batch plan. We have created a plan. At the core, the batch plan creates this. It could be a spreadsheet, or it could be a tool that we use, or it could be a very simple computation. At the end of it, this is what happens. It uses these rules, and it knows what the constraints are. It takes the input data, and it tries to drive towards the goal. It tries to find those set of numbers which can achieve the goal, or it's also called the objective, as best as possible. Some of the techniques that are used in planning, typically you use a lot of optimization techniques, a lot of optimization algorithms themselves were developed because of the need from logistics plans, and this is way back during the World War time, and it is still used. Because of the computational power, the optimization techniques also are used more and more. Not as much as I believe they should, but they are definitely used more and more. The other type of techniques are the rule-based heuristics, which are very extensively used, and this is a reason for that. And that's because usually rule-based and heuristic techniques work very well in capturing the business rules. And however quirky my rule may be, I'll be able to apply it in a rule, and my heuristics or rule-based algorithm will take care of it. It's much more difficult in an optimization setting. And the third part of it is statistical or stochastic techniques. And these are typically used when there's a lot of unknowns. So demand planning, for example, I would use a lot of statistical rules. Production planning, it will use either an optimization computation, or it could be rule-based heuristics, because there's a little bit more certainty in production side than in demand, where there's a lot of uncertainty. So I've listed only 3, but there could be some more, obviously. And the modern rules, I would club them either under rule-based or statistical. Basically. So this is what a batch plan does. So looking like from the batch run, maybe from the previous night or from that morning itself, these are the rules that would be used. And I just wanted to set the stage there, saying that when we say a batch plan, and later on when we start talking about algorithms for interactive planning, how does that differ from these? I think it will be useful for us to set the stage as far as what a batch plan algorithm typically is. What are these calculations all about? So that is all about calculations. And let's talk about cadence. Like I said, a pretty important aspect of the entire planning process is this thing called cadence. And planning is all about decision making. There are many aspects of decision that need to be made on the fly, which means 24/7. It needs to happen. But there is a very big place for cadence. Cadence is nothing but a cycle. It's a regular cycle that keeps happening. And the reason cadence is important is, actually there are 2 reasons why it's important. The consumers of your supply chain, they themselves follow a cadence. There are people, these are people, and people follow a cadence. As a human being, I follow a cadence, morning to night, I sleep in the night, wake up in the morning. So there are certain activities that I do that follow a daily cycle. There are certain activities that I do that follows a weekly cycle, and monthly and yearly and so on. So the consumers themselves have a cadence that has an implication on the supply chain. And also internally in the supply chain, the people who are part of the supply chain, both the people in execution as well as in the planning side, they're also humans. They also follow a cadence. And because of these, it is pretty important to recognize this fact and try to incorporate cadences in how we do things. And it's something that most companies anyway do. I'm just kind of probably formalizing it. But if you go to, hopefully if you go to most production shop floors, that morning they would have had a production plan meeting to determine what the plan would be for that day, or probably the next day. That days could be frozen, for all we know. So there are many companies which actually do this. I'm just trying to formalize this because the cadences, the daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, they interact with each other. The planning process is actually tied to these cadences. As when we set a planning process, it is the most important thing that we need to determine is what is the cadence going to be? When are we going to do this? Is it a daily cycle or a weekly cycle or a monthly cycle? Which day of the week? Which time of the day? And so on, right? So what we are setting here is the fact that these certain activities, certain decisions are going to take place at a certain day and time. That is essentially what we are setting out in the cadence. And once those decisions are taken, they are then sent to possibly execution or some other planning process, which has a different cadence. And that could be some other day and time. And these are all tied to each other. So why cadence? Cadence because it follows what triggers the decisions, which are the humans, consumers, our customers, our human beings. We ourselves have human beings in the supply chain, and they follow a cadence. All this, and it's a discussion in itself, but it suffices to say that all this results in cadences that we would need to follow in the supply chain. And can we do away with cadence? And that's a question that's there, and that's been asked increasingly, and that's because now a lot of supply chains are 24/7, and you can get delivery at any point in time. You can, production anywhere. A lot of production runs 3 shifts. Why should we even bother setting any cadence at all? Increasingly, people are saying, there'll be this monolithic system that will just take all decisions in the supply chain, and systems don't have cadence. Only if you have human beings that you will have cadence. And then what is planning going to look like, and what would interactive planning be? So all very good questions, and I'm sure many of you will have that. I probably cannot answer all of them, but as long as there are going to be humans involved in either decision making or execution, you probably cannot do away with cadence. And people have tried doing that to some extent, but decision making in cadence, in using a cadence, is going to be there. The cycle is going to be there. At the same time, it's definitely shrunk in the sense on-demand decision making, on as needed decision making is also increasing, and some of it we will discuss in interactive planning in the next section. And so the role of a company leader is to say what part of it, how does my cadence look like, and how does my intra-cadence or inter-cadence gap look like, and all the on-demand stuff which would be taken care of between 2 cadences, between 2 cycles of decision making. How does that get incorporated in the process? That's a pretty important decision that needs to be taken typically by the leadership when they set the processes, the planning processes. That's where all this comes in. So, for example, if I'm taking, let's say I'm a demand planner, I do forecasts every month at the beginning of the month, and that's my monthly cycle. But mid-month, something happens, some significant change happens. What is the process for incorporating it? Or on the production side, even more dynamic, where even if I'm planning every day, middle of the day, a new order comes in, and what happens? And the most tempting thing to do is just throw away the cadence. Anyway, I'm so dynamic. Why should I bother about cadence? But I have seen companies where this has happened, and they basically firefight on as needed basis, and it doesn't work. Cadence gives you that platform because there are many things that still happen in the Cadence. You don't want to lose sight of that. There are things that do not happen there, outside the Cadence. That is where you should look for Cadence on-demand decision making. So the balance between them is very, very important. Many aspects of interactive planning deal both with the Cadence generated plan and analyzing that, as well as the inter-Cadence activities that would happen. And we'll get to it when we talk about interactive planning. Okay, so I will move on to the next topic, and the next topic is pretty important as well. This is all part of planning. We're still in planning. We haven't gotten into aspects of interactive planning, but it's pretty important that we cover this. This is input management. This is so important that a lot of our time would be spent in as a planner would be spent in just managing input data. It's basically like saying that if I need to produce a product, then and I need to then in that case I need to do a good job of making sure I procure the right raw materials, which is indeed the case. But somehow we assume that the conversion of input to output is the kind of 90% important, and the 10% is all this input data that comes in. But if you ask a manufacturing person, they'll say, "Oh no, it's all the assembly and machining that I do is as important as is important, but so are the raw materials that go in." So there's the same philosophy here, and we know. We kind of know it at the back of the mind, but this requires basically a lot of grunt work to manage. The first thing is very obvious: in garbage in, garbage out. So there's no everyone knows it. How do we deal with it is the question, right? And there are a couple of tips here. At the last point, I'll mention that. I think the first few points are pretty obvious. Data errors. How do we take care of data errors? There are very simple ways, and there's nothing to learn in this, but there are ways we can try to automate catching errors in the input stage itself. There are ways in which we can automate finding out if there is missing data in the input stream of data itself, instead of waiting for the output to come in. And there are ways, or what needs to be instituted, which I saw happen pretty well when I was at Dell, is a quality management process for input data. So just like how you would, a manufacturing guy would say, I'm doing a QA on the parts. In the same way, we do a QA on the data that we get, raw material stock data, inventory data. Is it correct or not? Estimated time of arrivals of my inbound materials, is it correct or not? Sales that I did, is it correct or not? So basically considering data as an input and doing QA on it is a very important job. And it's strictly not part of interactive planning, which is meant to be kind of more focal point of this discussion, but it's so important that I thought I would mention it. Input data management, especially for planning, requires its own application, and I've seen that work pretty well in my old company, and the importance of this cannot be overemphasized. It's so important, and a lot of planners' time actually should go into making sure there are processes in place so that input data is managed effectively. I know, in lieu of tools, planners spend a lot of time in shipping data, making sure data is put from here to there, and that's where a lot of unproductive work goes in. But hopefully, if when they get to a stage where the systems are good and they don't have to keep manually uploading data and all that, then their job should be making sure that the processes for managing the quality of input data are in place. They review they review the quality at a periodic stage, just like how you review plans and past plans. The same way, I think the quality of data also has to be reviewed. This is something that I just want to share as a planner in Dell. We used to and actually have regular reviews of this, and it worked pretty well. It removed a lot of issues. Imagine you create a plan and you suddenly find that something is wrong, and just it's one data element that is wrong. Maybe it is that inventory value that just didn't come through, or your system couldn't catch it. Then your whole plan goes for a toss. So you don't start trusting the plan anymore, and you have to go back and you have to figure out what is the implication of this. And you say, okay, you know what, forget it. I'll just go back to my spreadsheets and just run through all this. And then you're back, as a planner, you're back to your old ways of just making sure somehow a decent number is generated. You have more time for then doing what ifs, being proactive, and all the good stuff that you would want to do. So it can have a pretty bad effect on the entire cycle of planning. So as an ex-planner, my advice to all the planners would be, make sure that the input data is managed pretty well, have an application set up for it, do quality management. So just want to mention this aspect of input management under planning. Okay, so the other thing which I would quickly want to touch upon before we go into interactive planning is the concept of is the idea of viewing output. How do I output? The plan is generated, and it could be as simple as just looking at it. And just wanted to share a couple of things just based on my experience in especially supply planning with planners, and what are the things that should be there basically. So the very first thing is actually the term taken to create it, and I think this is a very it's a trade-off that we need to make as a planning team in that company to say that how much time am I willing to wait for the batch plan to come in, especially if it's an optimization plan. That this happens all the time with especially optimization engines, and how much time am I willing to wait? If I wait for a long time, yes, maybe it will give me a better result, but then I lose time. And is on top of it, can I do interactive planning? Those are the questions that usually keep coming in. And among all these, I think this is the easiest. Although it's technically challenging, but I think that this decision, it is important to take that decision right away. It's important to set a limit on how long the plan can run. If the other ways of doing this, breaking it up and changing the process and so on, but letting it run for a long time, I haven't seen many benefits of that, basically. The second point that I wanted to mention is the fourth point, which is basically clarity on what you want. Sometimes as planners, we want this and that and that, but in some of these things could be conflicting themselves. So the reason this clarity is important, and the reason sometimes planners say that, although the implementation that we did of so-and-so tool failed, but during the process, I gained a lot. And basically, it was my clarity that improved. And that's happened to a lot of planners, whether the implementation is successful or not, because it forces you to think as to exactly what is needed. When we actually take decisions, right, on an ongoing basis without a tool, let's say with simpler spreadsheets, and some of the things get buried under some of the understanding that we should have, get buried under the subjective decisions that we take. But once we are forced to implement a tool and put some logic in, then we are thinking really about what is it that I really want? What are the things that I need to consider? And I think that then gets reflected in the output. The output that we see is a reflection of what we want the software, how we are driving the software. And I'll talk about insights later. That's the next step. But this is pretty important. Third is the output itself should be no more than what is needed for the planner. This is something that I've seen quite a bit, where a lot of things are there in front of them, and it just takes away. Look, I mean, increasingly planners are looking at more and more information. Each planner is managing a lot of things, and so the more we present to him or her, the more difficult it becomes for them to say what is relevant, what is not. And I think we need to be very careful about how we design what should be presented as an output to the planner, no more than necessary. And the first one is what I will talk last, which is how we present the information is also important. Now, here there are two extremes. One is planners. One is the premise that planners always like something in a tabular form, spreadsheets. That's what they used to. Just give it to them in that, and that's fine. That's good. That's all you need. The other extreme is that you need a very jazzy analytics tool which has 3 different types of visualization, or 10 different types of visualization in one page. Both extremes do not work, in my opinion, and I'm saying this as someone who has both designed this as well as used it. Definitely not the other extreme of a big dashboard where there are multiple things. That's good for executives. It's good for reviews. As a planner, it has to be very, very utilitarian, which means I'm doing my job. I need to keep looking at numbers. I need to have things that help me in that daily job. And it's pretty mundane. It's not as colorful or jazzy as some of the dashboards and so on would be, which is fine for an executive review, but for planners who are in the trench, it's different. At the same time, there are visualizations that we need to increasingly start looking at. This is a little bit more graphical, which reflects the job that they're doing. Someone like a transportation planner might obviously want to see things that reflect the transportation network that they're working with, or a production planner would want to see things a little bit more graphically. So, and all these years that was not done only because it did not provide the response that they needed. But I think slowly we will see more of these visualizations. Okay, so that's all I had about output. Analysis of plans and dynamics, they do involve a lot of interactive planning, and hence will be covered in the next section. But do keep in mind that the next topic that I'm going to talk about is insight. Getting insight is more important than being correct, and that's kind of the segue into interactive planning. So we are done with the planning section. The 3 or 4 points that I wanted to cover as part of planning, which I thought could be useful for planners before we get into interactive planning. I'll pause for a few seconds just to see if there are questions. So I'll move to the next section, which is basically interactive planning. So there are some aspects of interactive planning, certain principles that I thought drive the need for interactive planning. The first thing is that it's the planner who's more important than the problem, which is this is, you could find this pretty contentious and arguable, but in more. So the first point that just want to mention here is the fact that in planning, the planners decision making comes in pretty strong, which is why interactive planning is important. So this leads to why interactive planning is important. Why not just a system do the plan? Why should the planner even interact with the system? But the planner's decision making, comes in very strongly. Number one, and that's because of the fact that these three things, wherever I've highlighted, what they are saying is that the decision is ultimately made by a human, and so even though the software has basically given you a plan, whatever method you use, whatever software you use, it's basically giving you a plan. At the end of it, it is important that as the decision maker, as a planner, I have to interact with it significantly for me to get insights, and which eventually turn into decision making. So when we design processes and tools, when we are engaged in designing processes and tools, think both about how the tool will be built as well as how people will work with the tool. And it's not just the UI. It's also what are the things that a planner would need to take decisions, that he or she has to be given as much information as possible. At the end of it, decision should be theirs. And every decision-making step has to be a step towards improving their knowledge of how the planning should happen. So it should not be memoryless, where one planning is gone and planners just forget about everything and then we move to the next. And people are saying, hey, anyway, machine learning is going to take over everything. All the plan is going to be archived, and it'll tell what needs to be done. And planners may not even have a role. I don't believe so, and that's mainly because the correlation the correlation between different things, the physics of the supply chain, that is something that planners understand, and that's something software will not, even in the near future, 5 to 10 years. So I do believe that there's a role for human decision making, significant role for human decision making in planning, and the points that are highlighted are towards that. Basically, they are saying that it's not enough for you to run a software and say, I've crunched the numbers, this is the output, go ahead and execute it. It's not going to happen. You would need the people there, however sophisticated the software is, to check, to analyze it, to basically get a good understanding of what the plan is, why it is saying the way it is saying, and test the peripheries, test the boundaries, and then take decisions. Because at the end of it, even today, once the decisions are taken, when a post-mortem is done for good or bad, it's the person who took the decision that usually is first asked. Why did you take this decision? And if you say, no, I don't know, the system told me, probably not the right answer for most leaders as well, even today. Unless there's a conscious decision by the team to say these kind of decisions are going to be completely done by software, and we will take care of only exceptions, which is the right way to go, and we'll discuss that as well. And then you have to figure out why it did not come out as an exception. But the thing is, in the near future, even in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be very hard to take away the human. If you don't take away the human and they're going to take the decision, you cannot then have a very problem-oriented approach, a very extremely objective-oriented approach, or saying that, let me solve for the correct answer. There's probably not going to be anything called a correct answer, especially in supply chains. And so it's the things that are highlighted. It's basically enabling subjective decision-making for planners so that they can gain more insight is going to be the goal of the planning exercise and the planning tool itself. And so with that, I'll skip this, and there's a bunch of things, but this is really what I wanted to spend some time on. Just give me a second. It's this slide I wanted to spend some time on. It is going to be an important slide, because we're going to start here and then move into various aspects of UX, various aspects of what I call root cause analysis, aspects of incremental planning, and so on. So the reason why we do interactive planning, I could think of these 4 reasons. And what are the features of interactive planning that support these use cases are things on the top. So in my opinion, where does interactiveness even come in? First, to understand a plan. So I come in the morning, let's say I'm a production planner. I come in the morning, I look at a production plan, and the first thing I want to do is to understand what it is. What is it saying? And that itself, there is a level of heavy interactiveness there itself. And there's nothing has changed in terms of numbers. There is no change really. But as a human being, if I need to understand something, there is going to be a lot of back and forth. It's just not going to be one way. And so supporting the fact that a planner needs various different forms of inputs, or the same form of input, but in a much richer form, is something that we have to enable. That is a tool that absolutely it's a tool feature that absolutely has to be there. And I'll talk about each of them. So if I'm a planner, I need to come in and I need to understand. This is something that I've experienced quite a bit in Dell, where we have a supply plan. Now, they don't know why a certain factory was assigned certain lot of production. What was the logic that went into doing that? And why did the tool behave the way it did? Is it a black box? Should I just trust it? What if it is wrong? So understanding the plan is a very important aspect, because only then the trust gets built, and then they can take decisions. Decisions are taken by planners. So some of the things that I think we need to enable, just give me a second. Some of the things that we need to enable in the tool. The first thing is the UX. When I say UX, in the area of B2C applications, it usually means something more aesthetic, something much more where it's attractive. In a B2B software for planners, I'm looking for what I already mentioned, a utilitarian feature. It has to make my job easier. And I'm less bothered about aspects of aesthetics. Not that I'm not, but I'm less bothered about that than I am about things which make my job easier. My productivity is very important. Again, going back to the example, the planning team is kind of the central decision making. If they are not productive, quality of decisions are going to go down. So the first thing is UX, and under UX, I think the ability for them to have an interface which is dynamic, where they can look at a subset of it. They can drill up and drill down. It need not be a separate tool. It could very well be built in your own spreadsheet, or if you're going to build your own tool, lay some emphasis on how the planners will interact with the tool. To be able to export it to Excel. Excel is not too bad. I know we implement tools to move away from a lot of Excels, but you can still have a little bit of Excel just so that they can export and look at data and understand what's going on. I've seen that work pretty well. The ability to slice and dice, provide a little bit more options for visualization, and slowly we can start. Typically, when we either implement a tool or are starting to implement a tool, start looking at a little bit more options. They are not bad, and it need not be irrelevant. Like I said, a dashboard with 12 different things, but see what would make sense for planners to look at. Not executives. And here all this is about planners. As a planner, what is it that they would like to look, what is it that they could look at with the same level of performance of generating that report. And maybe we'll look at a couple of things. I have some examples here. And then root cause analysis is a very important aspect of interactive planning, just to understand the plan. What is causing the plan not to do what we wanted to do in the utopic sense is a very important report. And I'll give you a quick example of it. It's a mock-up and something called pre-built scenarios. So what I'll do is, instead of covering this entire matrix, I will start with just understanding a plan. What do I mean by interfaces and so on? So I will start with that, and I'll come back to this same matrix. We'll go to the next one. What does resolving exceptions mean, and so on. Okay, so we'll get into the details of this. Again, at any point in time, if you have a question, just feel free to jump in and ask. Okay, so when I said interfaces, I took a screenshot from our tool, and this is something if you're building your own tool, or you have an Excel sheet or a spreadsheet that you're building, or you have an existing tool and you want to export it, you could follow some of these tips. Okay, so one thing that we did is we try to go with a tabbed interface. So this is one issue with spreadsheets, especially if I want to look at the same data in multiple different ways, and it's in one spreadsheet, then it becomes difficult for me to do that or save it as another file. If I'm sharing it, it becomes difficult, and so on. So if you're going to move away from spreadsheets, then look to build something which lets you open multiple windows. You could say, oh my God, that could get out of hand, but that is a chance that you can take. And give that freedom to planners to open the same view in multiple different ways. Same table, let's say I want to open in multiple different tabs, so be it, because they might run a different filter on each of them. And that's all part of interactiveness. That's all part of trying to understand what the plan is all about. So that's the first thing. I would definitely recommend you going down the path of a tabbed interface, which is what we have done and in our tool. The second thing is to provide basically spreadsheet-like features. If you're having a tool, provide spreadsheet-like features in the tool, and that's what these three things are all about. Ability to filter, sort, pivot table, generating the pivot table, if possibly online itself, so that they don't have to export it to a spreadsheet. But give that export option as well. So basically here, what we are saying is that give as many options as possible for the planners to interact with the tool, to possibly export it, to filter it. These are all filters, down arrows, basically the filters, to maybe open it in an online, in a spreadsheet. Online, if they want to do some calculations, let them do that as well. And if it is possible for you to build an SQL-like interface into these tables, that would be awesome. And I've seen that work pretty well with when I was the planner in Dell. That's something I had asked for. We had built a prototype for that, and so basically the planner ends up querying the system, right? A lot of the planners, by the way, had to learn SQL so they could access the database. But if they could do something similar, not database SQL, but something similar with the tool, that will be ideal for a planner, because they are looking for something. The reason the planner in this state, the reason the planner is interfacing with the system is to understand the plan, and they're looking for certain things and trying to get that out of the system. They're not pushing this into something yet, not in this part of the interactiveness. So it's a question answer, right? They're asking some questions. So if you can, provide an interface where they can ask questions, that would be really awesome. So that's about the interface, just the basic interface part of it. The second thing is the is slicing and dicing. This I've found it pretty useful, especially for demand planners. So if there are demand planners, this is something that they do day in, day out. So the ability for me to drill down and drill up on any data element, and here I've basically demand-oriented data elements, but it could be on any data element along any line. This visualization, I think, should be accessible to all planners, including supply planners. Usually demand planners get it, but supply planners, I believe, should also have access to it. A lot of questions that they have and they are asked for is at an aggregated level. Usually they end up creating a plan at a lowest level, but they also have to either report at the aggregated level or have an understanding of what's happening at an aggregated level. And this capability, I think, should be there. So even if you're working with spreadsheets, I think you should be able to build this, the ability to aggregate, disaggregate. The disaggregation rule could get quite tricky in spreadsheets, especially. So if you're implementing a tool, do insist on having this capability. Definitely, that's what I would say. Multiple visualization options. So again, I would caution you against the extremes. A dashboard which is, let's say, all these things and a couple of more things is going to be confusing for the planners. At the same time, do recognize that the visualizations are getting richer, and even planners, the younger generation of planners are definitely going to ask for it. They're not going to say, I'll just look at it, spreadsheets and work with it. They are going to ask definitely for much richer visualizations. And the trick is going to be to offer those planners that level of visualization with a performance that you can get in a table-based visualization, because something like a graph like this, it will take more time. And if it's a much more complex graph with a lot of filtering and so on, then it's just going to, it needs more performance. It needs to give you the same response, it needs to have much more computational power, right? So it is through various ways of visualizing that the planner also gets to understand various aspects of the plan. So it is good to give variety of visualizations. Don't cram too many things in one place, but it's I think in this part of the activity of understanding the plan, slowly start increasing the variety of visualization options. If you're basically having your tool, is what I would suggest. And in any way, people are going to ask for it. The next generation is definitely going to ask for it. Exceptions reporting. This is I have a slum on tips, and this is something most tools offer. Make use of it. This is something even your spreadsheet can do. Make use of it. And I know it's very obvious. It's the simplest thing that any planning tool can do. We all know that. But I've also seen even this simple thing not being used. It's part of an interactive plan because it can lead to more interactiveness. It can lead you to understand the plan better and so on. Just whether you have a tool or you're building your own spreadsheet, make use of exceptions reporting. Define your exceptions clearly. I think technology is there where you can actually color code, do a lot of things with exceptions. I know we can do it in our tools, so I'm sure you'll be able to do in any tool that you have or your spreadsheet. So by all means, this is where you should start with, and lay a lot of focus on making rich exceptions reporting for the planners. Whatever is relevant for the planners. This is a lot of mistake that I see planners do is they build all this for executive reporting. These have to be for the day in the life of a planner. That's where it has to be addressed for, and it could take a completely different form depending on what the planner wants, right? So exceptions reporting, don't miss that. Root cause analysis is a very, very important thing, and I do want to spend a couple of minutes on maybe 5 minutes on this. And this is just it's a it's a mock-up screen of cooked up data. But root cause analysis is probably the most important tool aid for a planner to analyze a plan, especially in constrained cases. So imagine you are a master plan. So you're being given the demand plan. You're trying to figure out which factory is going to produce what, and then where is it going to get shipped to, and then how is the eventual delivery going to happen to your customers, and they could be distributors or consumers or whatever it is. But the entire supply path is going to come out of the master plan, and there are constraints along the way. There are probably typically three kinds of constraints: is capacity, either in production or in transportation. So probably material constraints, and time itself is a constraint. Lead time is a constraint. So there are constraints along the way, and once the plan comes out and the plan says, yeah, you know what, this we are running short on inventory here for all these days. Our safety stock is not going to be met. But yeah, we're able to satisfy the demand forecast otherwise. And in another place for another product, we are actually shorting the demand itself. So that is the output of the plan. The plan is saying that these are things that I'm not able to do, which I set out to do. And now your job is to understand why it is not doing what it should have done. And in many cases, that part of it is not very elegantly answered by the software. And if you build an Excel sheet to do that, to do the planning yourself, it might be a little bit of a challenge for you to then do a root cause analysis in an automated way as well. So root cause analysis is the process of telling you that if I have an exception anywhere, then why is that exception even happening? In this case, the exception is because of a capacity constraint. I'm low on inventory. It's because of a capacity constraint, and there is a certain quantity that has been impacted, and it tells you what the time period of impact as well is. And root cause analysis reports could get very complex as the planner wants it to be. I myself have built such reports in the past for various clients in the automotive and consumer goods spaces, and it could get pretty complex, but it is only as complex as your environment is, because the planners really do want to understand that if I'm not able to satisfy demand or inventory, what is the cost? Because if I can, maybe I can do something about it. Maybe I can expedite material or increase capacity or do air shipment instead of ocean, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but in many cases it is not, and sometimes it's even counterintuitive. So it is not advisable that we leave this to the planners to do and let them figure it out. Maybe they can look at the plan here and there and figure it out. No, absolutely not. If you are going to build a solution for planning, root cause analysis has to come along with it. Just like exception report, the root cause analysis has to come along with the plan output so that they can see what is causing these issues. There is an inverse of this. I don't have a screenshot for it. There is an inverse of root cause. For a given constraint, let's say this is PCKG4, what are all the exceptions that it is generating? So that is the inverse of this report, which is also very important. So both ways, understanding the root cause of an exception and understanding the effects of an exception, understanding the root cause of an exception, as well as understanding the exceptions for a given root cause, are both very, very useful tools for planners. I've both implemented it as a planner as well. I've used this, and whenever you implement a planning solution, make sure and in case it has constraints, if you're very constraint free, if you believe that you don't have too many issues on supply constraints, this is very particular to supply side of things, supply constraints, then that's fine. I think we need not put too much effort into this. But if you have constraints, especially in a capacity material time, then absolutely look to build this module. Okay. Okay. So the next one is pre-built scenario. This is something that I've again screenshots from our tool, but this is something that I found very useful with clients. I've not used this myself in Dell, but if I'm running a plan which has multiple constraints, this capacity, materials, and so on, in parallel, it will be very useful for me to have references of what would the plan be if I did not have these constraints. Let's say I did not have capacity issues, or I did not have to consider capacity at all. Then what would my plan look like? Would I be able to satisfy all the demand now? Or if I did not have materials, what would my plan look like? And all this done not after the plan is done, but it's pre-built, which means it is available to me as a planner, as a scenario, at the time of running the plan itself. So, for example, a production planner, when he generates the plan, then it'll be good to know for him, if there was no constraint, no capacity restrictions, and to satisfy a given demand set, what would it take? What kind of load would each machine have? In some cases, it could go over capacity, but really, what is it? And can I compare that with the constraint plan? And this is at the beginning itself. Monday morning, if I'm coming to look at the plan, it will be good for me to know this right away instead of having to run another planned run. It will be pretty good to give the planners at the beginning itself. And no more than 2 or 3, otherwise it just becomes too confusing for the planners. Yeah, the other utility for the usage of this is on the demand side as well. And I think this is something that some of you might be doing. So instead of saying I'm going to solve my forecast on the supply side of things, the forecast itself is a prediction, right? It will have a min-max. It could have a range. And I've seen that work pretty well. I've never done that myself, but I've seen in some companies, they have a range and they actually plan for both min-max and the average and all three as plan outputs. And it gives you a sense for what are the possibilities, basically. And maybe in certain cases, you plan for the max. So all these are basically different phases of the plan that are being provided to the planners so that they can effectively take the decision. Okay, so so we are done with the first section, which is, I'll go back to the matrix. Like I said, we are done with the first section of understanding a plan. We actually have 2 more sections, planning, resolution, and then both these are basically the same, and I will cover them under one section. So I'll again take a few seconds, I'll pause and see if there are any questions, and then we can move on. Okay, let's move on. The next part of an interactive plan is, I have the plan now, but I want to make some changes to the existing plan. Basically, resolving exceptions is one very common use of this feature. And so basically, planners are going to say that I'm looking at the plan, I know that these exceptions that are there, I can actually resolve it. I can make sure that they go away. I'll force it through. And it's something that I did not tell the system upfront. I don't want to. I want to handle it on my own, and as a team, or I'll get approval, whatever it is. There are ways. There are many reasons why they could say that, and that's another part of interactiveness. It's another use case for planners having to really work with the tool. And what happens here is, you typically would start with the root cause analysis report. You'll see exceptions, you'll see what is causing it. But then you will pretty quickly get into resolution mechanisms. How do I resolve an exception? This part of it, you have to, what I would say is that do not build this right away. I'm giving this example because it is powerful, but at the same time, over time, planners will figure out exactly what they need, and at that time, you can actually implement it in a tool. At the beginning, certain simple things could be implemented as part of this, but don't be very detailed about it. And I'll explain, once I explain what it involves, you can probably get a better understanding. So what happens is when you look at it, certain things like exceptions, root cause analysis, those are absolutely necessary. You need to have it day one of using the tool. But how I resolve exceptions actually is an evolving thing. And even some part of it should definitely be automated, but there are many aspects that may not, could not, or probably you won't be able to automate it to generalize in a general way. And some of it you could be able to. So I'm just saying, in this case, there are certain things that you could, if you're very sure, automate. There are certain things that don't bother automating or have semi-automated mechanisms, as we will see the third and fourth sections. Okay, I'll get into the second one, resolve exceptions in plan. So basically, what we are talking about is, if there are exceptions, how could we resolve them? And I'll give you a very quick workflow. We will not spend too much time on it, but I think it will be pretty useful. So there is, again, this is a screenshot from our tool where the planner is seeing an exception. In this case, the exception is there's a demand shortness of a certain quantity. And in this case, we have built a particular exception resolution mechanism on the software itself. So I'm going through this example to give you an idea of what are possible, what are the things that could be possible, and exactly how you will implement it in your own territory is something that you'll have to think through that. So one workflow, and for which we built this for, the customer we built this for, they're pretty clear that if this is the exception, these are kind of the resolution mechanisms that we need. And so it should, first of all, we should make it easy for the planner to jump from the exception to the resolution, let's say resolution bench. How does the person resolve it? The very first thing that the planner should then look at is, what are my possible resolution resolution possibilities. In this case, to satisfy that demand, there are all these possibilities. I can get material at the warehouse itself, but there is a cost associated with it. Or I can shrink the lead time, there's a cost associated with it. I can add capacity for a given supplier, cost associated. And then supplier material is also there, there's a cost associated. So these are penalties that we put. These could be actual costs or just penalties. And they reflect the fact that if I go down this resolution mechanism, which means I'm somehow going to satisfy the demand, either getting more material from a third party, or getting it from my standard suppliers, or expediting my transportation, then these are the costs. And I basically put in the costs. In this workbench, I'm just making sure that the costs are there, the right costs are there. And then I go ahead and actually let the tool suggest, in this case, what the action would be based on the costs that the tool will actually go ahead and suggest, and I can then go ahead and accept it or not. So this entire mechanism basically involves me going into the plan, making changes to the plan, and me going into the plan, identifying where I should be trying to resolve, looking at possibilities for resolution, and making sure the penalties for those possibilities are correct, and then letting the tool then recommend the right course of action to satisfy to resolve or satisfy. So in this case, whatever it takes to satisfy this 1200 units is what the tool would suggest, which is either based on material or capacity or and so on, transportation more. But the point is, in my solution, what I have done is I have built these possibilities. It's relatively complex. It's not going to be easy, and it's at the same time, if you're looking to become more mature in the planning process, this will be very, very useful. But don't do it on day one. It could confuse things, and you may not use it. But over time, when you see that repeatedly you're basically resolving it in a certain way, then start automating it. And one of the best ways to automate it is to put penalties on the various options, possibly modeled on the actual cost, and let the system then suggest, recommend what course of action should be. Then you go and pick. So here the system is suggesting these possible actions, and you go ahead and pick the best action forward. So this is all about resolution. This is the second. I'll go back to the matrix again, and this is the second row in the matrix. The third and fourth, like we said, we will combine that. We will basically talk about it in one lot, and it is basically about you can say scenario management or what if planning, how you call it. But there are 2 or 3 key things here which I think would be very important to understand. So one is the fact that a planner would actually want to spend most of his or her time in improving, in basically sharpening the axe, so to say, rather than just cutting down on the tree, right? So and which means sharpening the axe in the area of planning would basically mean anticipating what could happen, getting that insight. And you can get that insight only if you say, okay, if my demand is going to go 10% up, these are the issues that I can face. Or if this factory or this supplier is not going to provide it within the lead time that he's promising, then what are the implications? So doing those what ifs on potential changes, number one. And number two, very quickly understanding the impact of actual changes. So this is not trivial. I've myself been in environments where when a salesperson, a sales leader sometimes asks, can you do this? Can we satisfy this order or not? It takes us a while for us to respond, whether we can actually do it or not. And this is based, we have all the data, and still it took us quite a bit of time. So it is, it's not trivial, and I'm sure companies are getting better at it because of probably better systems, better input management, which we talked about earlier. But in both these cases, what we start with is a plan, a baseline plan. On top of it, we are laying down a situation which is different or which is incremental to the baseline plan, either different or incremental to the baseline plan. And the first thing that they need is something called a scenario management. So you need to have a notion of what is a baseline plan and what is a scenario. We call it a replica in the Spashta tools. Different tools and companies will call it differently, but that notion has to be there. This is my baseline, and this is a scenario that I created to simulate or to understand the impact of a certain change that I'm doing. It could be a change or an increment, like I said. And the tools there, actually there are two tools that you would need to have. One is the incremental planning capability. Now, in some cases, or actually in many cases, you could just boil the whole ocean again and say, I'm just redoing the entire plan based on this small incremental change. But that may not be advisable in actually most of the cases. But people won't like that. They'll say, don't upset other things because of one order that has come in for one product. Don't just redo the whole plan because the system will just reassign various things, and those are probably not going to happen in execution. You already release the plan or whatever. So you think through how your incremental planning algorithm would be. Yeah, so let me go to that slide. Can you guys still hear me fine? Sarah?
Yes, we can hear you. Krish, don't worry.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So basically, yeah, I didn't put in screenshots here, but the points that I wanted to talk about are, number one, the ability for a planner to create multiple scenarios. That's really important. And actually, if I go back to the screenshot here, just a few screenshots back, just a second, yeah, where I showed you, yeah, here. So here we've just shown two replicas. There could be any number of them. And these days, tools do come with the capability to have any number of scenarios the planners want, and they can delete it afterwards. And that capability is very, very important. So I'm putting asterisks on certain capabilities that I believe planners would absolutely need from planning point of view in an interactive sense. This is one of them. I said root cause analysis, exception reports, and this is probably coming next in terms of the ability for planners to do scenario-based management, create any number of scenarios. That's one. Let me scroll through. The ability to edit the input data itself on a scenario and do incremental planning. That's very important as well. And then after they do that, compare scenarios, right? So a quick screenshot of it could be as simple as this, where I have three scenarios now, three replicas, and I've run the plan. In some cases, there could be some difference. I don't know, maybe not. But I'm able to see what my on-hand, DSI, firm orders, all those things are in one shot across all those scenarios. This is something that planners would love to have. It's their own scenario. At least R1 could be their own scenario. These could be pre-built scenarios. And the planner is basically seeing all this in one shot in the same place. This is a very simple and extremely useful utility for planners where they can create scenarios that they want. They can make the changes, run it, and at the end of it, look at it as well in one place. So yeah, the last thing that we talked quite a bit about interactive planning, and I know we are running out of time. The last thing last couple of things that I wanted to mention here are some tips that I wanted to offer to planners. If the planning team is looking to build their own tool or looking to procure tools or get use some of the things that I thought would be useful is the first thing is know when to stop using spreadsheets and move into planning solutions. This is a very important thing. At some point in time, spreadsheets cannot scale, but till you reach that point, spreadsheets are just fine. So know when that should happen. It's probably different for different companies, but you should, as a planning team, you should know that and be very clear about it. Number one. Number two, scenario planning that we talked about. It'll be tempting to use the scenario planning in Excel, which is not too bad actually, but don't stretch it. It could kind of backfire in a little bit more complex cases if you're a very heavy Excel user and you build your own planning system in Excel. So be careful. If you use this, build an app for input data management. It's very important. I think we mentioned that input data is so important. It's not to do with interactive planning, but it's something that can have a lasting effect on the quality of the plans. Invest in root cause analysis, reports, and exception reporting. So these are the summary of some quick tips that I thought would be useful for planners. To summarize, I think so. We talked about planners. We talked about planning. This good level of complexity. Insights are more important than correctness, which is why interactiveness important. And analyzing a plan, modifying in what if planning. These are all parts of interactiveness. And at some point in time, start looking beyond spreadsheets. Be clear in what you want. Okay, so that's all I had in terms of a presentation. Thanks for listening through, and we have quite some time. I'll be around in the call. If you have questions, I'll be very happy to answer them.
So yeah, please everyone go ahead and do ask your questions. We have Sesh for another 15 minutes. So any questions related to the presentation or anything else around this topic is more than welcome. Do we just want to go around? Everyone can just talk about themselves who are on the call and just whatever concern they have in their mind regarding this. So we want to do that. Pooja, Vijay, Srihari, any questions? Any thought?
Yeah, hi Seshadri. Atul this side from Mahindra and Mahindra. So I have a doubt regarding Cadence that you were talking about. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So I have a doubt regarding Cadence. I could not understand the effect of intra-cadence and inter-cadence that you were talking about. So how to resolve that and what is the impact of that?
Right. Okay. Let me go back to right. So what happens is that things keep happening at any point in time, during any point in time of the day. I'm not sharing that. I think you should be able to see my screen now. Okay. So things keep happening, and that is a reality. They happen 24/7. It's in a continuum. But cadence is still important to do two things. One is to set some structure to the way planners are doing things, and number two, to honor the fact that some things that happen actually can wait for the next cadence. So it is okay. So cadence is still, don't throw away cadence. That is the message here. Don't throw away cadence. If you're doing planning every day, every week, continue doing that. And on top of it, when events happen between one planning cycle to another, then take care of it. But the trend that I'm seeing, and the reason I put this slide is the trend I'm seeing is that people have kind of thrown away cadence to see, could I just take care of it as and when they happen? I would say no. So if you don't have a cadence, if you don't have a very strong cadence, please enforce it. Please institutionalize it. Number one. Number two, I know your environment is every environment is very volatile. Take care of that volatility as the incremental plan that I talked about in interactive planning. The last part of it, what happens when something happens and I need to know what the impact of it is. Through that, you can take care of it, which means your cadence gives you the base plan. On top of it, you do incremental planning to see what is the impact of it. That is how I would suggest you take care of it, instead of throwing away the cadence and saying, okay, somehow we'll react to everything that happens on an as needed basis. That was my point. Did that answer the question?
So how to identify where cadence is applicable and where it is not?
Right. So in most cases, for a planner, cadence should be there, which means that the only question now is what is that cadence? Is it daily, every shift, weekly, whatever? It is not.
In case of, particularly in case of spares,
Yeah.
a lot of parts cadence, I don't see there is any pattern, and demand is very volatile.
Right. Correct. That's a very good extreme example. So you have parts where you probably get a demand every 3 months for one unit, and such parts could be there.
There are parts where we get demand daily, but there are many parts where we get demand once a year, or let's say once in a quarter, what you're saying. And once in 2-3 years also, there are some parts.
Correct. So there, based on my experience, what we have done is segmentation first. The first thing is we have to go through a segmentation exercise on the various classes of items, and different items will then go into different cadence. That is what we have recommended. Whenever I have worked with in companies in similar environments. So obviously the high runners, you'll have to have a daily cadence where you have to review what's happening every day. For the very sporadic ones, don't bother doing that. It's just adding to the mass. I would say deliberately don't have it, and use it. Do that only on an as-needed basis. And there are parts in between that happen. So the first step is to do a classification exercise. We call it segmentation in supply chain parlance.
Yeah.
If you do that, then you will know which follows what. So you could see. Yeah.
We follow the segmentation process, but like the tail end part, where the demand is not constant and where the demand fluctuates a lot. So that becomes a difficult part of handling the inventory. And that is where we land up with excess of inventory. And over there, we need some kind of planning tools to help us.
Right. Okay. I understand what you're saying. It probably is a slightly longer discussion.
It's okay. I'll take it one-on-one with you.
Right.
Your email ID has been shared with us.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I think that's thank you, Sesh, and thank you everyone for being wonderful participants to this session. We've shared the ID of Sesh. You can always write in to ask questions regarding your organization, etc. It would be great if you can drop in your ID in the chat box. So that's where Sesh's ID is shared. So we can send you a recording of this cloud, a version of the presentation that was shared, and other information that can help you going forward. Sesh, any thoughts from you?
No. Thanks a lot for listening through this, and I look forward to interacting with you. Even questions you have, feel free to. Quite passionate about planning, so any questions that you might have, anything that you have a comment on as well, please do write to me, speak to me. Would love to hear from you. Thanks a lot again for listening.
Thank you, everyone.